Welcome to the Missing Dots. Imagine everything you thought you knew about the Second Fitna flipped on its head. Popular narratives paint Marj Rahit as a minor skirmish, where greedy Umayyads crushed Zubayrids in a simple power grab. But what if the real axis was far deeper? Pre-Islamic tribal endogamous polarization between northern Keys and southern Yemen federations that exploded when central authority weakened. This battle was the day tribalism rewrote the caliphate. Al-Dahaq's campaign wasn't pure piety, it was Qaysite hegemony masked under Zubayrid legitimacy. Marwan's rise was bureaucratic realism, saving the empire from payroll collapse and provincial anarchy. Yet this victory planted the seeds of Umayyad self-destruction. On the Missing Dots, we conduct a definitive forensic audit, multidisciplinary, detached, and exhaustive. We deconstruct poet propaganda, abased Scrabble distortions, and constitutional paradoxes using sources, sociology, and CR metrics. If you're tired of emotional sermonizing and ready for the unspoken structural truths that still echo today, stay locked in. The Missing Dots are about to connect. The picture they form will challenge everything. You won't want to miss a single revelation.
SubhanAllah, sitting out here in the courtyard today, it's just so peaceful. It really gives you the space to sort of digest all of this.
Yeah, it does. And honestly, looking deeply into these sources you brought today, it's jarring. I mean, if you're listening to this, you've probably grown up hearing the standard narrative about the Second Fitna.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all did.
Right. I always pictured it as this massive, purely religious struggle, like piety against corruption, righteousness against tyranny. But when you look at the actual forensic history of what happened at Marj Rahit in 684 CE, it completely shatters that illusion. It was just so incredibly material.
It really forces a total shift in perspective. We are so used to looking at history through through the theological banners that the armies were waving. You know?
Right, the slogans.
Exactly, the slogans. But if you want to understand the reality of 7th century Syria, you really have to ignore those religious slogans for a moment and look at whose hand was actually on the sword, like who was fighting, and probably more importantly, who was getting paid.
The money. It always comes back to the money.
Always. And the traditional story just completely misses that demographic reality on the ground.
Which is where this whole Qays and Yemen divide comes in. And honestly, before we started exploring this material, I just thought of them as, two random groups of Arabs. I didn't realize it was this massive structural fracture.
Yeah, massive is honestly an understatement. This was a geographical and cultural divide that predated Islam by centuries.
Yeah.
You essentially had two parallel Arab societies trying to occupy the exact same imperial space in Syria.
Okay, so paint that picture for me. Who are the Yemen?
So on one side, you have the Yemen. These were the southern Arab tribes, anchored really heavily by a massive group called the Kalb. And the thing you have to understand is they weren't newcomers.
Right.
They had been living in Syria, serving as auxiliaries for the Byzantine Empire long before the Islamic conquests even began.
So they were already completely entrenched. They knew the land, they knew the administration, all of it.
Exactly that. So when the Umayyad dynasty first established itself under Muawiyah, he looked around at this massive established Yemeni population and realized he needed them to govern. He actually married into the Kalb tribe.
Oh, wow. So he literally tied his family to them.
Yeah, he essentially built the early Syrian state entirely on their loyalty. And because of that, the Yemen ended up controlling the most critical part of the state, which was the Atta.
Okay, wait, let's pause there for a second.
Well,
when you say they controlled the Atta, what are we actually talking about in practical terms? Is it land? Tax collection? Like, what is it?
it's the garrison payroll, the military stipends.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the state registry basically determined how much money every single soldier and their family received from the treasury. Because the Yemeni tribes were the established elite with direct ties to the caliph, they utterly dominated those registries.
So they're getting the biggest cuts.
The biggest cuts. They got the highest stipends, the best land grants, the top administrative posts. I mean, the entire political economy of Syria relied on keeping these southern tribes wealthy and satisfied.
Okay, so that's the Yemen. They're comfortable. But then you have the Qays, and they were the newcomers, right?
Yeah.
The ones who arrived with the Muslim armies.
Right. The Qays were the Northern Arab Federation. They migrated into northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia mainly during and after the initial conquests. And these guys were the shock troops.
The frontline fighters.
Exactly. They bled for the expansion of the borders, but when they settled in Syria, they found out that all of the doors to real wealth and power were already locked from the inside by the Yamen.
Man, just imagine that for a second. You're a Qusaysian soldier. You've just fought on the Byzantine frontier, risking your life. You come back to Damascus and you realize some Yemeni soldier is getting paid twice as much as you, purely because his grandfather made an alliance with the local governor like 50 years ago.
It breeds incredible resentment. I mean, how could it not?
Well,
The Kays felt structurally marginalized. They were treated as second-class citizens in a state they were actively fighting to expand.
SubhanAllah. And Islam had suppressed this kind of tribal favoritism initially, right?
It did, but underneath the surface, it was still a zero-sum competition for resources. And that pressure cooker was it was waiting for a moment of weakness at the top to just explode.
Which brings us to a really fascinating character in all this Al-Dahaq ibn case. Because if you read the standard popular histories, Al-Dahaq is almost always painted as this pious, righteous figure.
No, totally. The ultimate loyalist.
Right. He's portrayed as a strict loyalist to Abdullah ibn al-Zubair, the rival caliph sitting all the way in Mecca. The story goes that Al-Dahaq was fighting to bring Syria under the righteous rule of Mecca. But looking at the actual timeline of his career, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense.
It doesn't hold up to scrutiny at all. I mean, Al-Dahaq was not some lifelong ideological dissident. He was the ultimate Umayyad insider.
Wait, wasn't he literally the head of security?
Yes. He served as the head of security for Muawiyah. He was the governor of Damascus. He faithfully served 3 generations of Umayyad rulers. You don't just wake up one morning with a sudden theological objection to the very Syrian state you helped build.
So why did he flip then? Because he was the one who rallied the Kays to fight for the Zubayrid cause. Why do that if he's an insider?
He flipped because he saw a vacuum. He was an opportunist. In 684 CE, the Umayyad dynasty basically just collapses in on itself. Yazid dies, his young son Muawiyah II abdicates and dies shortly after.
So suddenly nobody's in charge.
Nobody. There is no Umayyad leader. So Al-Dahaq looks at the situation, realizes the established Yemeni elites are momentarily paralyzed without a patron, and decides to make a play.
Man, when you frame it like that, this wasn't a holy crusade at all. It feels way more like a hostile corporate takeover.
Corporate takeover.
Yeah, like you have a disgruntled regional branch, the Kays, using the name of a distant CEO in Mecca just to seize control of the headquarters bank accounts in Damascus.
That is actually a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The Zubayrid name provided the required religious and symbolic cover. I mean, you couldn't just stand up and say, I'm fighting to get my tribe more money.
Right, that doesn't really rally the troops spiritually.
No, you needed a legitimate banner, and Ibn al-Zubayr in Mecca was that banner. But the operational reality on the ground had nothing to do with Mecca. It was a purely Kaysite bid to capture the Syrian fiscal network and just rewrite those payroll registries in their own favor.
So Ibn al-Zubayr's actual authority in Syria was what? Mostly imaginary.
Practically non-existent. The real muscle on the ground belonged entirely to Al-Dahaq.
Okay, but if Al-Dahaq and his Qusay coalition are basically lighting a match and trying to steal the treasury, who actually steps up to stop them? Because the Umayyads, like you said, are totally headless at this point.
This is where we hit the absolute crisis point of the year 64 AH. It's hard to overstate how close the entire Islamic Empire came to just shattering completely right then.
Because the pay stops.
Exactly. Without a central leader in Damascus, the payroll systems were going to default. If the troops don't get paid, they mutiny. If they mutiny, the provincial governments collapse. And remember, the Byzantine Empire is sitting right on the border, heavily armed, and just watching all of this happen.
Right, but what about Ibn al-Zubayr? He's in Mecca. He's widely respected. Why couldn't the Syrian elites just say, all right, you're the caliph now, send us some governors, and let's keep the borders secure?
Because of a concept in Islamic political thought called shaka.
Shaka. Muscle.
Muscle, yeah. Logistics, administrative capacity, the coercive power to actually govern. Ibn al-Zubayr had the moral prestige of being in the holy sanctuary, sure, but he was logistically isolated in the Hejaz.
He didn't have the infrastructure.
Right, he didn't have the tax collectors, the standing army, or the bureaucratic machinery to manage the Byzantine frontier from 1,000 miles away across the desert. If the Syrian elites had just submitted to Mecca, The Diwan, the state registry, would have completely fragmented.
It would have just devolved into warlords carving up the provinces.
Yeah. Exactly. So the Syrian elites, primarily the Yamen, who desperately want to protect their status, realize they need a local solution, and they need it fast.
And that leads to the summit at Al-Qabiya.
Yes. Shabiya was this ancient military camp and tribal capital in the Golan Heights. And you have to picture this gathering wasn't some grand spiritual council. It was a frantic crisis negotiation among the Syrian tribal and military elites.
They needed a candidate.
They needed someone from the Umayyad family who could hold the state together.
And they land on Marwan ibn al-Hakam, who, to be fair, was not some young hotshot military commander at this point.
Not at all. Marwan was an elder statesman. He was in his 60s. I mean, he had been a secretary to Caliph Uthman decades earlier. He had been the governor of Medina. He was a survivor.
So he knows how the game is played.
Completely. When he arrived at Shabiya, he sat down with the Yamani leadership and struck a fiercely pragmatic deal. In exchange for their allegiance, their Beyah Marwan promised that the Yamani tribes would maintain their privileged status, their high stipends would continue to flow, and the administrative continuity of the state would be protected.
Okay, I hear you. But honestly, if you're a critic, doesn't that just sound like a very convenient excuse? Like, oh, we had to break the normal rules of consultation to save the state. Because we know that the ideal method for choosing a leader was supposed to be broader consultation, right? A true shura.
Right, the ideal is shura.
So how did the classical scholars and jurists of the time actually swallow a leader chosen through backroom tribal bargaining?
It is the great constitutional paradox of the era, and classical jurists grappled with it intensely. When they analyzed this in the context of siyar, which is Islamic public law, they didn't pretend the summit at Shabiya was some perfect democratic ideal.
They knew it was messy.
They absolutely knew. Instead, they validated Marwan's rise through the legal principle of darura.
Darura. Necessity.
Pure necessity. The overriding public interest, the maslaha, was preserving the state from total disintegration. If Marwan hadn't secured that Yamani alliance, the empire wouldn't have just lost a dynasty, it would have splintered into dozens of predatory, warring fiefdoms.
And the Byzantine army would have marched right into Syria.
Without a doubt. A beyah secured through regional tribal dominance is obviously not the utopian ideal, but jurists recognized that preventing the total collapse of society was the higher priority. Marwan had the Shaka to govern. At that specific moment, Ibn al-Zubayr did not.
Wow. That is such a fascinating look at crisis management versus idealism. I mean, you can't eat ideals if the Byzantine army is burning your crotch.
Exactly.
So Marwan secures his backing. He has this massive Yamani military machine behind him, and this puts him on a direct collision course with al-Haq.
Yes. The summit ends, the armies mobilize, and these two massive tribal coalitions finally clash on the plains of Mardrahit, which is just outside Damascus. You have al-Dahaq and the Qays on one side, Marwan and the Yaman on the other.
And geographically, the battlefield favored the Yaman, didn't it?
It heavily favored them. The plains of Mardrahit are very flat and open, which is the perfect terrain for heavy cavalry. And the Yamani forces, especially the Kalb, had decades of experience fighting alongside and against Byzantine heavy cavalry.
So they were just better equipped for this specific kind of fight.
Oh, far better. When the battle started, it was incredibly brutal. I mean, there were attempts at negotiation on the field, but they broke down almost immediately because both sides knew this was existential.
It wasn't just about who got to be caliph anymore.
No, it was about who got to control the wealth of the empire.
And the Yaman just decimated them.
They did. They launched massive shock charges against the Kaysite lines. The northern tribes broke, and al-Haq himself was killed on the battlefield.
Which completely decapitates the Kaysite project. I mean, they lose their figurehead, they lose their momentum. So Marwan walks away with Damascus, he secures the treasury, and he essentially saves the state bureaucracy.
He does. Love it or hate it, it's a masterpiece of pragmatic, bureaucratic survival.
But this is where the historiography, the way this is written about, gets so incredibly messy. Because if you read the texts from the time, this pragmatic survival story gets twisted into something completely different. It depends entirely on who is holding the pen.
That is the real tragedy of studying this period. You are never just reading history, you are reading layers and layers of propaganda. And there were two distinct layers of spin applied to Mardrahit.
Let's start with the first one.
The first was from the Umayyads themselves, immediately after the battle.
Because they knew they had a legitimacy problem, right?
Exactly. The Marwanids knew they had just seized power using a very specific tribal coalition, and that contradicts the core egalitarian message of Islam. You can't just stand up in the mosque and say, I am your ruler because the Kalb tribe wants to keep their stipends.
Yeah, that's not going to fly. So they turned to the mass media of the 7th century.
Poetry. They patronized these incredible court poets, famous ones like Al-Akhtal, and these poets used a traditional form of competitive poetry called Naqa'id. They epicized the battle.
So they elevated it.
They took a messy, deeply material civil war over resources and transformed it into a cosmic narrative. In the poetry, the Umayyads weren't just politicians making backroom deals. They were God's chosen deputies, appointed by divine decree to restore order.
And how did they frame the keys?
The keys were framed not as political rivals, but as agents of chaos and religious deviance.
It's incredible how effective that is. Just spin the narrative. But then you fast forward about 70 years, the Abbasid revolution happens, the Umayyads are overthrown, and suddenly the narrative flips completely in the other direction.
Right, because the Abbasids needed to justify their violent revolution, which meant they had to completely delegitimize everything the Umayyads had ever done. The major historical chronicles that we actually rely on today, written by giants like Al-Tabari and al-Baladhuri, were compiled a century or two later under Abbasid patronage.
So how do you actually rewrite history 200 years after the fact? I mean, you can't just burn all the old books, right?
You don't have to burn the books, you just change the vocabulary and shift the emphasis. The Abbasid scribes weaponized the language. For example, they largely stopped referring to the Umayyads as caliphs.
Really? What do they call them?
They started calling them kings Muluk.
Oh, wow. Because a caliph is a religious successor, but a king is just a secular tyrant holding on to power. That's subtle, but huge.
Precisely. It completely strips away their spiritual legitimacy. They also drastically inflated the casualty numbers at Marj Rahid. They emphasized every graphic, brutal detail of tribal savagery they could find just to paint the Marwanids as godless tribalists wading through Muslim blood.
And in the process, they conveniently erased all the actual functioning state building that Marwan and his successors did.
Completely erased it. I mean, if you only read the Abbasid chronicles, you would think the Umayyads were just chaotic warlords. You would never know that Marwan's son, Abd al-Malik, executed some of the most brilliant administrative reforms in history shortly after this battle. He centralized the government, he translated all the fiscal records from Greek and Persian into Arabic, he minted the first purely Islamic coinage.
That's massive.
It is, but the Abbasids systematically downplayed all of that to frame the entire conflict as a simple story of Abbasid piety rescuing the world from Umayyad corruption.
You know, if you're listening to this, you're probably wondering exactly what I'm wondering right now. If the Umayyads are paying poets to say they are cosmic heroes, and the Abbasids are paying historians to say they are barbaric kings, how does anyone actually know what happened? How do modern historians find the truth in all that noise?
It takes a lot of forensic work. Modern historians don't just take the chronicles at face value anymore. They triangulate the texts. They look at the chains of transmission to see exactly when and where a story mutated. But more importantly, they look at the material evidence, because the ground doesn't lie.
Right. Things like coins and buildings.
Coins, papyri tax receipts preserved in Egypt, the physical layout of garrison cities. When you look at the tax receipts from the years following Marj Rahid, you don't see chaos.
What do you see?
You see an incredibly organized, highly functioning bureaucratic machine. The material evidence proves the administrative continuity that the Abbasid historians tried so hard to ignore.
But even looking at that reality, it wasn't a clean slate, was it? I mean, Marwan saved the state that day, he kept the Byzantine armies out, he kept the payrolls running, but the method he used, making that exclusive deal with the Yaman, it feels like he planted a time bomb directly into the foundation of his own empire.
He really did. The victory at Marj Rahid was the absolute definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, it secured Syria for the Marwanids in the short term, but it hardwired an unhealable intergenerational blood feud between the Keys and the Yaman directly into the military spine of the caliphate.
And this didn't just stay in Syria, did it? Because the empire kept expanding, so this tribal virus just traveled with the armies.
It spread everywhere. As the armies pushed out, the factionalism went with them. Every major provincial garrison, from Al-Andalus in modern-day Spain all the way to Khorasan in Central Asia, became viciously polarized along Keys and Yaman lines. Your tribal affiliation determined everything. It determined if you got a military appointment, how much your stipend was, whether your family had political influence. It created this endless cycle of blood debt.
So if a caliph appointed a Yamani governor, the Kays would revolt.
Exactly. And if he tried to appease the Kays, the Yaman would withhold their taxes or refuse to fight.
So every single time an Umayyad caliph needed to raise an army or secure a province, they had to navigate this incredibly toxic factionalism.
It completely exhausted the state. Every succession crisis for the next 70 years was shaped by this zero-sum tribal competition. It made the military incredibly brittle, which actually brings us to the great North African sociologist Ibn Khaldun.
Right, his theory of asabiya. Let's talk about that.
So Ibn Khaldun coined this concept of asabiya, which roughly translates to group solidarity or social cohesion. It's the raw tribal loyalty that binds a group together and gives them the power to conquer or survive.
The glue.
The glue, exactly. And Ibn Khaldun pointed out the ultimate irony of the Umayyad dynasty. The exact tribal asabiya, that intense Yamani solidarity that Marwan relied on to save the state at Jabiya and Mardrahit, became the structural rot that eventually consumed them.
Because you can't build a universal empire on exclusive tribal loyalty.
You just can't. When the Abbasid Revolution finally started brewing in the eastern province of Khorasan decades later, the Umayyad garrisons there should have been strong enough to crush it, but they couldn't.
Let me guess, they were too busy fighting each other.
Exactly. The Kanes and Yaman soldiers in those garrisons hated each other so much and mistrusted each other so deeply that they couldn't mount a unified defense. The empire fell because its own military was paralyzed by the grudge born at Marj Rafid.
Nah, think about that. They essentially solved a massive short-term crisis. They stopped the collapse of the state, but they took out a loan with a 70-year interest rate that eventually bankrupted their entire civilization.
The bill for Mardrahit came due in 132 AH, when the Abbasids wiped the Umayyads out. The state was structurally rotten from the inside out. It just goes to prove that factionalism might work for a quick mobilization, but it is a poison pill for long-term stability.
It really makes you pause and think about the structures we rely on today, you know?
Yeah.
You look at modern institutions, corporations, even whole nations facing crises. When things get difficult, what do we fall back on? Do we do the hard work of building merit-based equitable systems? Or do we rely on our own modern versions of Kays and Yaman like nepotism, factional loyalty, corporate cliques, just to survive the quarter?
Yeah, that's the real question.
Because if this history from 684 CE teaches us anything, it's that relying on factionalism might keep you alive for today, but the bill always comes due eventually. You simply cannot outrun structural rot. To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to... Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.